An admission first, when I first took on this role, it was quite daunting in that we faced market access barriers in just about every export market we sent product to, and including a whole range of markets, of course, we didn't send any product to. But we've made some useful inroads over the past 15 years, and the primary vehicle we as an industry have used is a jointly funded market access program. And when I say jointly funded, it's producer levies matched with the processor contribution. So it's a whole of a supply chain effort to address the impacts in terms of market access. The proposition's quite simple. We want to facilitate or enable trade. We want as many markets open and competing for our product as we can. Two key areas within that program, absolutely defending favourable market access that we currently enjoy. It's a market maintenance type program, if you like. But then, of course, strategic trade reform, so addressing all the impediments. So Michael indicated there's economic barriers, so think there tariffs and quotas. And in the non-tariff barrier spaces, everything else that costs us money doing business overseas. So it's labelling, it's certification, it's product bans, it's just having export establishments accredited to supply a market. And so that's where we're starting from. That's the premise of the program. Today I want to touch on the operating environment we find ourselves in at the moment, and that's been alluded to a little bit so far. Importantly, what's MLA's contribution in addressing some of that environmental, and I'll call it disruption because that's what we're facing. What we do in terms of alleviation within the market access program, and importantly, has any of that made a difference or not, and what are our priorities going forward? So if we look at the framework and where we're positioned, unfortunately for our sector, and this is beef and sheep meat and goat meat all combined onto one graph, there are pockets of resistance there, those in red who have tariffs that exceed 40%. So for every dollar, there's another 40% tariff or tax on our products. The aim of the market access program is to turn the world green. Quite simply, zero tariffs, free access. And we were trending in the right direction. So if you look at the graph on the left-hand side, a reduction by both developed and developing countries of tariffs around the world. This is not just red meat, this is all products, all combined into one graph. Very positive. Contrary to that was the non-tariff barrier space. And you can see there, while alleviation in terms of the blue line is going up, so we're addressing more non-tariff barriers, the red line on that right-hand side there is going up far greater. So there's an increased incidence of these non-tariff barriers globally. Unfortunately, we as a sector are not immune from that outcome. None of this is a surprise. You would have heard it all in the news recently. Trade disruption really caused by politics that are out of our control. So the United States, America first, we want Australia first, but America first, imposing tariffs on some of their key customers. The US imposing tariffs on China, China then retaliating and imposing tariffs on US product, and similar with the European Union. Add to that the messy divorce between the UK and the EU, and it's quite a challenging global environment that we face. As you heard earlier this morning, the United States, China, key markets for us, the European Union and the United Kingdom, key potential markets in terms of expanding our access. So we're going to navigate our way through the politics. And our real concern is that we'll face some collateral damage in all of this. It hasn't impacted us directly, but we've got to keep our eye on it. And two key issues here that are top of mind. Our grain-fed beef access into the European Union is under threat, with the United States wanting to carve out the majority of that 45,000 tonne quota for their own. And Josie's going to talk more about that shortly, but a key defensive interest for us in terms of the market access space. And secondly, these divorce proceedings. It's likely that our quotas, both beef and sheep meat into the EU, are going to be split between the UK and the European Union, making our current small quotas even smaller and reducing our flexibility to trade around Europe. So we've got to keep our eyes on the game in this one, and the Australian government's working particularly closely with us to try and avoid any detrimental consequences. So what are we doing as MLA in terms of positioning ourselves given what I've just painted? Natalie mentioned insights, and that's a key. We have a team of internationally based staff who are monitoring what's going on in market and feeding that information back. We did a survey recently of industry and government stakeholders. There's some of the positive comments they saw in terms of MLA's market access contribution. But the overwhelming outcome from it is that government and industry need further insights into what's happening. The world's moving so quickly at present, politics is moving so quickly, we need to keep a vibe on what's going on. But we then need to take those insights and have some perspective about what these issues are actually costing us. Now here I've just used a non-tariff barrier example. We did some research 2 years ago. The impact of non-tariff barriers on the Australian sheep, beef and goat meat industries is about $3.4 billion per annum. So that's a lost value. We're not maximising what we could in international markets because of these impediments. And you can see the split between the various species on the slide. We then need to, of course, take that quantification and knowledge and turn it into priorities. What are we going to focus on as an industry? Where are we going to actually get some traction in some of this area? We can't do that alone, and I acknowledge the very strong support of the Australian government. The Department of Agriculture is placing 6 new agricultural counsellors in some of our overseas markets to help alleviate some of these barriers. And the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade has set up a non-tariff barrier division to help coordinate government effort across non-tariff barriers. So very, very useful, and you saw those slides where non-tariff barriers are increasing in terms of importance. We need the government support to help us tackle these barriers. We can't do it alone as an industry. And positioning, the most important thing we can do as an industry is have one message but multiple voices reiterating that same message. We have to be unambiguous in terms of our positioning across all these issues and work very closely with the government to prosecute an outcome on our behalf. In alleviation, now I came up with a whole lot of adjectives to start with. P was the easiest way to do this one. The proposition's quite simple when talking about alleviation. It's turning all those roadblocks into opportunities for our sector. That's a lot easier said, of course, than done. And the first P here is absolutely persistence. Unfortunately, this trade reform does not happen overnight. This is our Indonesian FTA, very current in the news the last couple of weeks due to issues beyond our industry. But it took 8 years to negotiate. The upside is certain access for live cattle, certain access for red meat products, and zero tariffs across the board. So we can get this one locked away, be very useful. We've had a bit of a delay in the signing, which you would have heard about recently, but it's crucial that we get this one in. Indonesia's a vitally important market for the Australian red meat sector. Michael referred to the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or it's now known as the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, or TPP-11. This was under threat, this one. One of the first things that the new Trump administration did was withdraw the United States from the old TPP. Now this whole agreement risked falling apart were it not for the persistence and the perseverance of the other 11 members that still remain, of which Australia's one. That agreement comes into force on the 30th of December this year. New opportunities. We do not have, apart from now TPP, access into Canada and Mexico, free access. We will have free access, zero tariffs into both those countries. But importantly, in terms of Japan and this graph, we'd already concluded an FTA with Japan. So beef tariffs in this instance went down to between 23 and 19.5%. Importantly, the TPP goes further and reduces those tariffs down to 9%. This isn't where America's first, it's actually where America's last, because America remains on the 38.5% tariff. The United States is our major competitor in Japan, and unless they do a bilateral deal with Japan or rejoin the TPP, we're going to have a near 30% tariff advantage over the United States in Japan going forward. So again, very useful, but we had to hang in there to reap the results. Pragmatic's my next one, and this is China. We've already alluded to that. The China-Australia Free Trade Agreement delivered 0 tariffs across the board for our sector on all product lines, including skins and hides, and most of those go to China for further processing. So some fantastic results there, but we're really struggling in terms of non-tariff barriers. And John's going to talk about a bit further in the next session about unlocking the potential in China, but it's one we've got to keep our eyes on and work away at to realise the real gains that we're going to get from the FTA. Persuasive, well, that's where the European Union comes in. Unfortunately, beef and sheep meat have been classified as sensitive by the European Union. That's the downside. The upside is the negotiations are underway. In fact, the negotiators are in Canberra this week doing the second round of trade talks. Our aim is to address our quite punitive access into the European Union. It's the first time in 40 years we've had this opportunity. It's one of our highest value markets in the world and something we're going to pursue as much as we can. The other P will have to have theirs patience, because I don't think this is going to be a quick result, but some useful and worthwhile returns. It's one of the missing pieces in that world of that trade barriers, and one of the reds that I highlighted earlier. None of this comes together without a partnership. We have to have a partnership domestically, the Australian industry and the Australian government, as I mentioned before. But the other thing we can bring to the party is alliances. So it's well and good pushing from our side. We need some alliances in market to also make representations to their own governments to lobby for increased access for Australian products. So MLA works very hard with our industry partners in pushing that global alliance agenda forward. Has any of that made a difference? Fortunately, it has. So that's the good news story. And if you look at it, we've plotted this as a market access index. So if you look at 100 being highly restrictive access and 0 being totally free access, Australia has a clear preference. Australia has a clear preference. Go to the lectern. So Australia has a clear preference over every other beef exporter in the world, and this is non-tariff barriers and tariffs combined, and that gives us an access into a multitude of markets that perhaps some of our competitors don't. The only one that's close to us is New Zealand, and I've got a couple of New Zealand beef and lamb guys in the audience today. They share a similar access globally that Australia does. And the majority of that gain, and where we've been trending down, has come through the trifecta of FTAs we've managed to negotiate. So the value of these should not be underestimated. If I was to quantify it, the trifecta of FTAs, Japan, Korea and China, it's 20 billion over the next 20 years. So it's about $1 billion in extra value just by removing the tariff imposts on our product. So quite significant. It's realising that extra value in the markets that we were previously paying a tariff on. If I were to break that down even further, and this is just the China FTA alone, it's underpinning beef prices by about 8 cents a kilo, and it's also underpinning sheep meat prices by 13 to 26 cents a kilo. That's just one FTA is adding to a positive price effect. We've also chalked up some gains in terms of non-tariff barriers. I said we're having trouble alleviating them, but we've addressed some of them. In terms of Indonesia, we now have access for secondary beef cuts and offals, which were previously banned items in Indonesia. And we've made some gains in shelf life in the Middle East. So this is for high-valued chilled product that had a quite restrictive shelf life or expiry date on it. And we've managed to get those extended, which has opened up a whole new opportunity for us. And similarly in Iran. Future reform, we've got a lot of work still to do. We've got 1.6 billion probably in future value to reap out of FTAs. A lot of that's going to be what we get out of Europe. And non-tariff barriers, I'd say we addressed some of it, but out of that 3.4 billion, we've still got about 2.5 to get over the line. So our targets going forward, absolutely defend our access into Europe. That is under threat, and we need to do everything we can to ensure that we can keep accessing that market. There's a couple of trade agreements we haven't completed. The Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, the main gain there is India, particularly on sheep meat. So we'd like to get that one across the line. And the GCC with the Gulf Cooperation Council, the Middle East countries, large consumers of beef and sheep meat from Australia. Again, addressing the tariffs and also some other costs that are involved in certification into the Middle East would be most advantageous. Our emphasis going forward in terms of the market access program, yes, the EU, UK non-tariff barriers, I've alluded to that. We also want to look at some future markets that we haven't got across the line yet. Taiwan's the missing piece in North Asia, and South Africa, a useful beef and particularly sheep meat market that we'd love to pursue. So we'll be working with the Australian government to see how we can move those forward. And WTO and the adherence to World Trade Organization rules that underpins global trade, particularly important at this time of global trade disruption. So we're looking at the market access program, and to wrap up, we need to work cohesively and in collaboration with the Australian government. It's a joint effort to get this over the line. That'll enable us to maximise opportunities, some in existing markets, but also new markets that we haven't dabbled in to date, and importantly, minimise the risk. I mean, there may be some hiccups with some of our customer markets given the trade scenario I painted. The more markets we have open, the more we're likely to avoid some of the hiccups. And finally, there's no point in doing any of this unless we're adding to our competitiveness overseas versus every other beef or sheep meat supplier that's competing against us for the consumer stomach. And importantly, we must continue to support supply chain profitability. Thank you for your time.